Hello, I'm Craig Barton and welcome to this Tips for Teachers video. Now this Tips for Teachers video is going to be a little bit different to ones that I've recorded in the past. For a start, it's probably going to be a fair bit longer, so I'll apologise for that in advance. But secondly, and I think I could be done under the Trades Descriptions Act here, I don't really think I'm going to be offering any tips. It's more that I'm going to be challenging you to think and reflect on your own practice to see if any ideas come from it. I don't know if this is going to work, this could be an absolute disaster, but let's give it a go. Alright, so I want to start by my view on formative assessment, and I don't think this is particularly controversial. But what I believe is if there's ever an opportunity to get all your students' responses to a question, as opposed to just one or two that you may pick by saying, Matthew, what do you think about this? Miriam, do you agree? Then we should take it. Why should we take it? Well, I think there are 5 benefits of collecting as many responses from your students as possible. The first is you don't get that biased sample. If I ask Matthew what the answer is and Matthew gets it right, there's a real danger I assume that everybody understands it. The converse is also true, by the way. If I ask a question and Matthew gets it wrong, I may think, okay, this is a problem that I need to revisit with the whole class, whereas in fact it might just be Matthew who doesn't understand it. You don't get that if you collect in more responses from your kids. Secondly, we get the fact that confident students can't dominate. That happens so much, right? If we allow hands up, if we say things like, anybody know the answer to this? You get the same kids who dominate time and time and time again. Third, I think this one often gets missed. If students know that they're all going to be assessed for their understanding, there's an incentive for all students to think. If students realise that the teacher just tends to ask 1 or 2 students each question, even if they're different students and they do things like cold call, then I think students kind of play a bit of a gamble here and think, well, there's 25, 30 kids in the class here. What are the chances that Sir or Miss is going to ask me here? Pretty low. If they do ask me, okay, fair enough, I'll start doing my thinking there and then. Whereas if in fact we're collecting responses from all students, then there's an incentive for all students to think hard. Fourth, this I think is an interesting one as well. Whenever you just ask 1 or 2 students, it's always going to be a bit of a surprise what answer they're going to give. You can predict what Matthew might say and what Olivia might say and so on. But you don't get to see the responses of the rest of the kids. Whereas if you find some way for all students to respond, then you can choose which answers to focus on. So you may see an answer that you didn't expect, and you can then use that as a key focus point. So the more answers that you see from your students, the more information you get. So the more you can then tactically choose which answers that you want to focus on and share with the rest of the class. The chance of you finding all those answers is drastically reduced if you just pick 1 or 2 students. And finally, you can then do things with the answers. If all the students have responded, they can then have some really good peer discussions with each other. If it's just 1 or 2 students who've responded, then you've only really got one answer to then focus on and so on. So I know that's all obvious stuff, but I just wanted to kind of state my case before we start talking about the different lesson phases. By the way, of course, pause the video at any stage if you want to reflect on any of this. Right. I think there are, well, this isn't an exhaustive list, but I'm going to share 5 possible phases in a lesson. And we're going to use these phases to then think about how we might go about collecting as much information from our students as possible when we ask questions. So we have what's often known as the do now or the starter, and I'm thinking specifically here one that's designed to enable students to retrieve stuff that they've learned in the past. Then we might have a prerequisite knowledge check. Some people will fuse these two together. Then we have the explanation or worked example or modelling phase of a lesson. Then we may have some practice in lots of different forms. And finally, we'll have however we decide to wrap up the lesson, a plenary, an exit ticket and so on. Not every lesson is going to contain these 5 phases. Some are going to contain more, some are going to contain less. But I think hopefully this is quite a useful structure to use to start thinking about our formative assessment strategies. All right, so let's start with this retrieval do now. So we know from research into memory, this is a really smart thing to do. And not necessarily at the start of the lesson, but at some point in students' weeks, it's a really good idea to get them thinking hard about stuff that they've learned in the past, quite simply so they don't forget it. One really popular structure for this is the last lesson, last topic, last term, last year. I think this is really, really nice. It gets students reflecting on something that they've learned really recently before they start to forget it, but then it bubbles up topics that they've learned at different phases in the past. I think that's really nice. But what I'm interested in here is, and this is the point I'd like you to pause your video, is I'd like you to think about the way you, if you do one, your retrieval or do now or starter, How do you get the responses from your students? Do you or could you get responses from all your students? And when and how do you respond to these responses? And once you've had a chance to think about that, press play again and I'll just do a few reflections myself. Okay, welcome back. So let's just think a little bit more about this retrieval or do now. So the first thing I wanted to say is I don't think the teacher's responses to this are time sensitive. So let's say, for example, that we do a do now and it turns out that everybody's forgotten how to do question 1. And question 1 was something that students studied, 3 months ago. We don't necessarily have to respond to that there and then if it's not prerequisite knowledge for the idea that we're going to be teaching students. We can instead say to the kids, look, I can see this is a problem. Don't worry about it. I'm going to go away and think about the best way I can to explain this to you, and we'll revisit this tomorrow or next week. Secondly, there's a real danger with all this that we get this, what I call the illusion of retrieval. And that is we think that just because we've included questions on something students studied 3 months ago, a year ago, and so on, that we're actually inducing retrieval. But of course, unless students engage with it and think really hard about it, then they don't get any of the retrieval benefits. Mere exposure isn't enough. Now, I've spoken in a previous Tips for Teachers video how showing the students a model of the forgetting curve is potentially a way to get them to take retrieval a bit more seriously, but you'll have your own ideas about this. And finally, what's really important here, and this is true of all of these, is feedback's needed in the sense that students need to know whether they're right or wrong from these answers. What you don't want here is to do the retrieval starter and students then go away thinking, oh, nice one, I got that right, when in fact that they didn't. We don't want them practicing the wrong thing. So I always showcase the answers to the retrieval or the do now task, whether it's just projecting those answers up or having the working out with them and so on and so forth, or however you may choose to do it. It's important students know whether they're right or wrong. Now, how you go about collecting all the responses from your kids during the do now is going to be completely up to you. The obvious thing that screams out to me is mini whiteboards here. I don't think there's a much more efficient way of doing this. There are ways with technology potentially, and we'll get into that a little later. But mini whiteboards for me, I think, are going to be the most powerful tool for this, and that's going to be a recurring theme. But anyway, feel free to pause the video again at this stage if you just want to reflect on that more. All right, let's move into the second phase of this lesson, the prerequisite knowledge check. Now, this is where, surprise, surprise, we assess students' knowledge of anything that's going to be important that they need to know so we can build this new idea on top of it. We don't want to build a new idea on shaky foundations. Now, one of my preferred ways of doing a prerequisite knowledge check is diagnostic questions. I find them really quick and easy to ask. We can dig into the misconceptions and so on. But also we could just have some open response questions for a prerequisite knowledge check, something like that. This may be for I'm about to teach area or circumference of a circle, so I may choose to do things like this. One idea that's really interesting is doing the prerequisite knowledge check before the lesson. This is really nice. So you set students a homework or a quiz that consists of questions that's prerequisite knowledge for the next idea they're going to be taught. It automatically marks it for them. This is just taking off diagnostic questions, but there's loads of systems that do this, of course. You then are armed with all that information. So the start of the next lesson, instead of doing the assessment, you can do the responding. You can just say, okay, wow, question 1, this is problematic for our students, so let's focus on that, as opposed to question 8 and 9, kids have nailed that, so we don't need to worry about that, and so on and so forth. All right, so over to you. What does your prerequisite knowledge check look like? How do you get the responses from your students? Is it one-to-one, or can you get all the responses from your kids? And how do you respond to the kids' responses to your prerequisite knowledge check? Pause the video and just consider that, please. Okay, so just a few thoughts from me on prerequisite knowledge. And the first is, I would argue, this is a bold claim, but of all the phases of a lesson where you want to collect information from all your students, I think this is the most important one. If we go back to that scenario I outlined at the start where you ask a question and you ask it to the whole class, but you just collect in Michael's response and Michael gets it right, you assume that everyone knows it. Well, if that assumption is false, this is going to be really problematic because then we're building new ideas on shaky foundations. So of all the times we want to collect as many responses as possible, I think the prerequisite knowledge check is arguably the most important. Secondly, whatever you decide to do, and this is true of everything, you want it to be manageable. Often I do work with maths departments about assessment for learning, and they come up with these amazing strategies, what they're going to do, and the kids are going to respond, and the teacher's going to respond, the kids are going to respond back, and the P&Ls. It all sounds great, but it's just not manageable. And if it's not manageable in terms of a workload perspective for the teacher, if it's not manageable in terms of a time perspective within lessons for the kids, it just doesn't last. It just disappears. So anything you come up with has got to be manageable from your perspective and the kids' perspective. And finally, we've always got the question of what on earth do we do during a prerequisite knowledge check if half the kids know the answer and half the kids don't? Well, I've spoken about this in a prior video. But one of my preferred ways of dealing with this, particularly if I just flip back, if I'm using diagnostic questions, is let's imagine half the class get this right and half the class get this wrong. Then I'm going to explain the answer to everybody, and then I'm going to say, okay, if you're still confused by this, I want you to listen to me, and maybe I'll come up with another example or do some teaching and so on. If you're happy with this, then what I want you to do is I want you to change one thing about this question that makes answer A the correct answer. One thing about this question that makes answer D the correct answer, and so on. So I'm going to use the wrong answers to challenge my students who are secure with this. But you all have your different ways of doing that. So again, perhaps you want to pause the video at this point and just reflect on your prerequisite knowledge check. Okay, halfway. Explanation, the worked example phase, and the modelling phase of the process. So I have my way of doing this that many of you will be familiar with, my worked example, which I'll do silent teacher, then we'll use self-explanation prompts to do the thinking side of things, and then there'll be the your turn and so on. And when I visit schools, there's lots of different ways of doing this. I see students practicing on devices which are immediately giving them feedback, and the teacher can then see the screens of all the kids that they're working on and so on. But I'm interested in what you do. What's your explanation and worked example phase look like? And this, I think, is really interesting this time. How do you get the responses from your students? And is it all the kids who are responding when you're asking questions like, why did I do that? What happened there? And so on. Or is it just one or two? And how and when do you respond to those responses? Okay, so let's just reflect on this for a bit. Another bold claim alert. Of all the phases of a lesson where teachers use formative assessment, I think this is the weakest. I'm hand on heart, I'm saying this for my lessons as well. This is where one-to-one questioning seems to dominate. So I always use Michael, I don't know why. Michael, where did the 5 come from this line to this line? It's always one-to-one questioning. Very rarely do I see whole class assessment during explanations or worked examples, or even in the your turn bit that immediately follows it. But of course we need this because we need to know whether this is sinking in or not. It tends to be these one-to-one questions that are happening. And I'll tell you the thing that's interesting about this is it's very easy to be passive as a student during the explanation, the modelling and the worked example phase. You can just nod along, oh yeah, I'm getting it. And not even in a deceptive way. You're not thinking, oh, I'm consciously trying to trick the teacher here. Maybe you think you're understanding it because the teacher's giving lots of cues, lots of scaffolding, lots of support. So in order to make sure that we're actually getting an accurate sense of whether our students are understanding what we're doing, I think we need this whole class assessment strategy. But as I say, I very rarely see it at this stage of the lesson. And again, I think worked examples, mini whiteboards are a good way potentially to achieve this. So maybe just reflect on that for a moment. Okay, I want to move to the practice phase now. So here students are independently practicing, they're working through some work that you've set and so on. It may be, again, I'll do lots of different types of practice, fluency practice. This is an example of some intelligent practice that I may do on probability. Again, I often see technology being used here. This is using the Dr. Frost Maths platform. The students are practicing independently on this bit. The teacher can see the results coming in and so on and so forth. What does your practice phase look like? And crucially, how do you get the responses from your students when they're practicing? How can you see what they're understanding and what they're not? Is it 1 or 2 students you get this from? Could you get it from all your students? And how do you respond to these responses? How do you react to that information that's coming in? Pause the video at this stage. Okay, just a few thoughts on the practice phase. Technology can be used quite nicely here for this if you're lucky enough that your students have got access to devices. And of course, this could be practice at home as well. Students can be using technology. And what's really nice about technology is that students know whether they're right or wrong. They get that immediate feedback either just as soon as they've done a question or when they submit it all at the end of a quiz. And that's really important. That leads me into this as well. Regardless of whether we use technology or not, Joe Morgan spoke about this on a Tips for Teachers video. Kids need to know whether they're right or wrong. They need access to the answers. It's that classic thing, practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. In the past, I've made the mistake, and I'm pretty sure it is a mistake, the kids have been working for 15, 20 minutes, and then at the end of the lesson, the answers come up on the board. The problem with that, of course, is if students have gone wrong early on, they've probably then been practicing and reinforcing that wrong way of doing things. Of course, the flip side of this is you may think, well, if I have all the answers available, kids aren't going to be doing any thinking, they're going to be copying things down. So I think the ways of managing this, I think what works quite well, if you have, say, a 10-question quiz or exercise, the students start working on question 1, and after a couple of minutes, just silently on the board, you go through question 1, so they've got the work solution there. And then you say to the kids, okay, just so you know, sorry to interrupt you, but question 1's on the board, just have a quick check that you've got it right, and if you're stuck on anything, put your hand up. And then a few minutes later, pick out another key question, like question 4, and then go through the answer to that. Just so students have always got that kind of checkpoint that they can use, so they never go too far practicing the wrong thing. Then at the end of the lesson, they can have access to all the answers. And the final thing with the practice, it's really important if you're, well, it's an opportunity, I should say. If you're able to collect students' responses, as opposed to just what did you get, kids can then share those responses with the person next to them, so they can have peer discussion. And also, you can share interesting responses, interesting methods, misconceptions, examples of excellence with the whole class. If your students' responses to the practice remain hidden from you until you take the books in later on or whenever it may be, you don't have the opportunity to do that, or at least it's nowhere near as powerful. Whereas if you're regularly collecting in responses from your kids, you can make use of those responses. So again, just a few thoughts on practice. Feel free to pause this video at any stage. All right, the end is in sight, and quite ironically, we're at the plenary or the exit ticket. So this may be the end of the lesson. Traditionally, exit tickets are done paper-based. I've done a Tips for Teachers video on this. I personally prefer to use diagnostic questions for exit tickets for the reasons I outline in the Tips for Teachers video on that, so check that one out. But again, technology can come into play here, students answering exit tickets, the teacher looking at them as they're coming in, or looking at them later on when they're at home, and so on. Exit ticket after the lesson's an interesting thing. This often, I'm recording this, well, I love to say post-pandemic, but it's not really, but certainly post kind of school lockdown and remote teaching. Teachers, I think, got really good at setting exit tickets after the lesson during remote teaching. And what that would be, the students would do the lesson kind of on the screens remotely, and then the teacher would set a homework, which was kind of like an exit ticket based on what the kids had just done, and it would be automatically marked and so on and so forth. I think this is really nice, just in the same sense that I think the prerequisite knowledge before the lesson's nice. So setting, 2 or 3 questions using technology based on what the kids have studied that lesson, that then gets automatically marked. You can see the results and then respond the next lesson. I think it's really, really nice, and there's loads of tools out there that'll do it. So for the final time, what about your plenary and exit ticket? So how do you get the responses from your students from that? Is it 1 or 2, or can you get all the responses? And how and when do you respond to those responses? Okay, final thoughts from me on this one. Again, I don't think this is time sensitive in the sense that you don't have to respond to the exit ticket straight away. You may, and I think you probably do, want to respond at the start of the next lesson, otherwise what's the point in asking the exit ticket? But it's not as if you need to collect in all the responses immediately and respond in the moment like you would need to do, for example, with the prerequisite knowledge check. The pitch of the exit ticket, I think, is really important. I've made the mistake in the past that the exit ticket's always the hardest question, that the kids will do that lesson. I don't think that's right. I want to pitch it somewhere in the middle. It's kind of like a target question that I want all students to be able to answer. And we may have gone further than that in the lesson itself, but the exit ticket is just to give me a sense of where the kids are at. Are they on track for where I hope that they would be? And finally, this goes back to that manageability thing that we talked about earlier on, or workload. You don't want exit tickets to take a long time to mark. That's why I like using diagnostic questions, 0 time to mark. It just does it all in the lesson, or some form of technology. If exit tickets are taking ages to mark, you're just not going to do them because you don't have time. So there are 5 possible phases in a lesson. I'd like to set you one final challenge, if this is all right. I'd like you to pick one of those phases that you want to try and improve the collection of student responses to. And by that I mean pick one of those phases that at the moment you don't think you get as much information as you could do about how your students are understanding things. Perhaps you do a lot of one-to-one questions in the explanation, or a lot of one-to-one questions in the prerequisite knowledge check. Pick one of those that you want to work on. And have a think, how are you going to do it? Is it going to be mini whiteboards? Are there other ways of doing it? How are you going to get all those responses? How are you going to respond? Just pick one and make that your target, your focus to try and work on, to try and improve that. Ideally get another colleague to work on something else, and you can then collaborate, share strategies and so on. They can even watch you in the lessons, whatever works. But pick one of those to be your focus to work on, and let's see if we can improve getting as much information as we can from our kids so that we can respond appropriately. So what did you think of that? As I say, slightly different tips for teachers video. Probably, if this is bombed, it'll be the last one of these I ever do, but let me know if that's of any use whatsoever. If you could like the video and subscribe to the Tips for Teachers YouTube channel, I'd massively appreciate it. And visit tipsforteachers.co.uk for loads more tips. Thanks so much for watching.